Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Hsien Loong. Good afternoon, Prime Minister, Mr. Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, Minister Heng Swee Keat, Minister for Education, Singapore, Mr. Michael Palmer, Speaker of the House, Singapore Parliament, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, Singapore, ISAS, and Aspen Institute, India, I warmly welcome you to the dialogue with the Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Hsien Loong. It's my pleasure now to invite Mr. Gautam Thapar, Chairman, Aspen Institute, India, to deliver his opening remarks and introduce the Prime Minister. Mr. Thapar, please.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to this special session of the Singapore Symposium, the session with His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Hsien Loong. Singapore as a country stands for exceptional leadership in numerous ways. The Prime Minister himself symbolizes this more than anyone else. Aspen Institute India is delighted to partner with the Institute of South Asian Studies Singapore for this event, and I wish to especially acknowledge Ambassador Pillay, Chairman of ISAS, and his team. The strong partnership between Singapore and India is much valued. This relationship has grown steadily over the last 20 years, and it is a remarkable story of how two countries bonded, traveled the highs and lows, built an inimitable partnership, one that has gone beyond trade and investment to span education, skill, defense, and other significant areas. Here, I would like to recognize the special role of the Singapore Education Minister, Mr. Heng Swee Keat, who you know spoke earlier about educating every child, the key to sustained development. Mr. Prime Minister, if you ever want an endorsement of your popularity, I am about to offer you one. Within 24 hours of Aspen India sending out its first mailer for this session, we had 250 confirmations, well beyond our capacity, but something that encouraged us enormously. And it is this high-quality audience today that we have here today that is a measure of the respect you command here. We are here to listen to you. We are here to learn from you. And we are here because you and Singapore are very special. We would like to thank you very much for giving Aspen India and ISAS these unique opportunities. Next month, the Prime Minister will complete 12 years in office, 20 years after he was first elected and entered Parliament, a long experience-filled process steadily rising to the current position. In 1985, he led a crucial national committee which recommended major policy changes, a drastic reduction of corporate and personal taxes, something that we went through here in the early 90s. In 1990, he became Deputy Prime Minister with responsibility for the economy and civil services. He was Minister of Finance from 2001 to 2007 and initiated the liberalization of the financial sector. As Prime Minister, he has launched the policies to build a competitive economy and an inclusive society. Before I hand over to Mr. Jamshed Godrej, Chairman Emeritus of the Aspen Institute India, to moderate this special session with the Prime Minister, please join me in welcoming the Prime Minister of Singapore, His Excellency, Mr. Hsien Loong.
Thank you. Thank you, Gautam. I'm especially privileged, Mr. Prime Minister, to moderate this interaction with you. And I can only say by introduction is that my family's association with Singapore actually predates Singapore. We started out in Malaysia, and then when Singapore became a separate country, we continued to invest in Singapore. And it's been a wonderful experience for us. And a few years ago, when Singapore decided to promote the industrial park in Vietnam, we were amongst the first to invest there. And I think that it's wonderful to have, even in Vietnam, the same type of administrative convenience that one gets in Singapore. So I want to personally thank you for that and appreciate all that you have done for the relations between us. Let me turn to our bilateral relations, Mr. Prime Minister. Singapore and India, as Gautam referred, have had long association. I remember one of our former prime ministers, when he came to Singapore and introduced himself, he said, "Singa is in my name, and so is it in Singapore." And so there is a long history of association. And we consider Singapore amongst our best friend in Asia. And so my question to you is, what is it that attracts you to India? What is it that brings you here?
We see great advantage in India participating with us in the prosperity of the region. And we see ourselves being a good friend of India, maybe being helpful in a small way, helping a much bigger friend to make progress and to do well in the world. India has a role to play not just on the subcontinent, but in Asia and in the world. And in the last 20 years, I think India's links with Asia have grown considerably. Partly our CECA, our Economic Cooperation Agreement with India has helped, but also India's cooperation with ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, and with the East Asia Summit, with a broader community of nations in Asia. We think India has a contribution to make. We think as India transforms itself, it will have soft power to project. Bollywood certainly is very popular in Asia, including in Singapore. And it's much more than Bollywood. It's a respect and regard we have for your progress and your ambitions to improve your life.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Let me ask you about Singapore. We live in very volatile and difficult times. Singapore, as you've said, is a small country, but it has the advantage of being geographically very strategic. And of course, we all face challenges today in the world. But we look to Singapore for high value services and for high governance levels. And my question to you is, how are you going to be, in this economic milieu, how are you going to be able to sustain this? A few years ago, you chaired in Singapore the economic strategy process. And I'm sure that there were many learnings and you were thinking of some new initiatives. And we would appreciate understanding from you those ideas.
Well, you have to look at it both from the supply side and the demand side. On the supply side, we must make sure that we educate our people so that they have the skills and the know-how in order to do high-value jobs. Because if you don't have the know-how, the jobs can come, but you can't do them. And that means good education, preschool, school, post-secondary, whether it's in an institute of technical education, vocational training, whether it's a polytechnic education, a diploma of practical-oriented know-how, whether it's in university education, and a diverse range of university education. So we put a lot of emphasis into education to get our people ready. You heard my Minister for Education just now. I'm sure he talked about some of these things. And we continue on beyond the school and university stage into the work stage, because we believe that our people in the workforce as adults have to continue to learn and relearn new skills through their life so that they can continue to do their jobs, new jobs, and better jobs. And as the technology changes, as new jobs come into the market, you can transfer your skills and apply them in a new environment, which will become very necessary, because this is a world where many of the jobs we will be doing in the next 20 years haven't even been invented. The companies certainly don't exist yet. So that's on the supply side of it. We also, on the supply side of it, have to bring in good investments and good projects. And that means keep ourselves an environment where companies are able to do business, where companies find it attractive to set up their headquarters, what we call their control tower functions, manpower management, their treasury functions, their audit functions, their human resource functions, and use Singapore as a connection to the operations all over the world. We have done that. Many companies are in Singapore. Many Indian companies have set up their headquarters in Singapore, global headquarters in Singapore. And we think that that's one sort of business which we can bring in, which can make the most of our skills. We need specific projects too. For example, in the last few years, you probably have heard that we have built 2 integrated resorts in Singapore. What are integrated resorts? Well, you have food, you have entertainment, you have retail, you have hotels, and you also have gambling, casinos. So there are 2, but in proportion, so it's really a whole range of things, and with a little casino inside. And we have 2 of these integrated resorts, and they have been tremendously successful. Our tourism numbers have gone up dramatically. Last year, I think we had 13 million visitors, something like that. And from the point of view of the government, it has been remunerative. Somebody asked in Parliament how much revenue we got from the resorts per year, and we did an estimate, and it's about 1 billion Singapore dollars per year of tax revenue, plus about $300 million where we levy fees on Singaporeans who go in to discourage them from going in too great numbers. And that's put to good charitable use. But it's created about 30,000 jobs, and it's generated a tremendous buzz for the economy. People know about Singapore, and if you see our skyline of our Marina Bay downtown, you see these 3 buildings with a boat-shaped roof on top of it, you know that's Singapore. So that's generated buzz, it's generated activities, and I think it's brought us to the next level. And we have to keep on looking for ideas like that, or if not single ideas like that, at least a range of activities which can continue to bring us buzz and excitement and improve the lives of our people.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. I was very happy to meet some of your members of parliament here, and I believe your speaker is also here. We also have some members of our parliament here, and also who are trustees on Aspen India board, and Mr. Shashi Tharoor is here, Mr. N.K. Singh is here, amongst others. Shashi, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, and welcome, Mr. Prime Minister. It's a great pleasure to have you in India, and many of us have had long-standing admiration for the remarkable transformations of Singapore and the ongoing reinvention of your country with each passing year, it seems sometimes. Turning to India again, there was a time in which your father was kind enough to visit this country and make public speeches about not just about India-Singapore relations, but about India itself. I notice that so far you have resisted the temptation, but I wonder if I can encourage you to express your thoughts on what you see of India's development, its governance, and the challenges it faces as it attempts to transform itself, overcoming the enormous difficulties of poverty, sanitation, healthcare, education, and so on, many of which Singapore, on a much smaller scale undoubtedly, has conquered so effectively.
I have not felt tempted to make such speeches. But I would say I have great admiration for what has been done in India over the last 20 years since Dr. Manmohan Singh first became finance minister and Mr. Narasimha Rao, who was the prime minister, which Mr. Godrej referred to, embarked on the Look East program and reform of the Indian economy. You gave the lie to the idea of an Hindu rate of growth. You proceeded with transformations and changes which people did not believe possible, and you've brought India where it is today. But of course, it's a continuing process, and it's a moving target. Moving target because the world moves on, moving target because the aspirations of your own people change. And as you reach a new level, people ask, why not we go further? And indeed, there's every reason why India should be able to go further and to be able to grow not just at 7+%, which is what you're projecting now, but 8, 9% for another 5, 10 years, easily. Because the potential is there, the human capabilities are there. I think the technological know-how is significantly available. Your leading companies are world-class, and you also have big areas where you can, if you could catch up even half the gap, you would already make a big difference. I think the challenge for you is that it's a very diverse country, and you need to find some way to make everybody feel that policies which will benefit India as a whole will ultimately benefit themselves in their segment of the country, in their state, in their village, in their panchayat, and themselves. And so let's get it moving. I think that if you go to some of the states of India, there's a lot of positive dynamism. I mean, the state wants things to be transformed, they're moving, going ahead. You can talk to the state government, and a lot of things will happen. And you can see variations from state to state. In other states, the process is slower. I think the domestic political considerations are never absent, but if you can square those with an alignment with India's long-term interests, you will be able to make significant further progress. The transformations are not easy anymore. I mean, you've done the easy things, so there will be trade-offs, there will be some pain, there will be resistance, but if you can overcome them, I think you can grow a lot faster. Definitely in terms of public policy, in terms of regulatory rules, in terms of fiscal policy. I don't have to tell you what are the things which you are trying to do, because your government itself has been trying to implement them. But to develop the consensus to do so is not so easy. Because when you're in a government, you know it wants to be done. When you're in opposition, you know that it's in your interest to raise difficulties for the government. And sometimes you've been on both sides of the issue, and both positions have changed, but nothing has changed. And I think that is a difficulty. In the long run, you can say, well, with a democracy, with a consensus, with the discussions, you have a more stable basis, because then you have a safety valve and you never have the pressure build up and become unsustainable. But in the short run, it makes it more complicated for you to do what many people know needs to be done.
So, Nandu Singh, he's also now advising the government of Bihar. And I was amazed to find that land prices in Bihar are now higher than in Calcutta.
I have not visited Bihar, but I'm told that's one of the happening places in India.
Well, Prime Minister, we'd be privileged to welcome you and welcome you in multiple ways, also for the very creative role which Singapore has played in fostering the Nalanda University, which is one of the projects on which we have now made very tangible progress. So welcome, Prime Minister, on behalf of the state government. Anytime which meets with your convenience, we'd also take you to Nalanda. Prime Minister, I had the privilege of participating very recently in Singapore under the aegis of Aspen on the Indo-Singapore Strategic Dialogue. One of the concerns which many of the economists based in Singapore mentioned in the course of that dialogue was this issue of inclusive growth and this harmonization of growth and equity as being a growing concern in Singapore. Indeed, that is India's growing concern of how to really balance high rates of growth with making growth more equitable and inclusive. And one solution, of course, is how to really learn from Singapore on making the Indian society far more innovative and seeking the cutting edge of innovation and using science and technology to be able to bridge the gap between the aspirations between high growth and high equity. What advice would you want to offer to us on how to make the Indian society far more innovative than it has been so far?
Well, on our own side, we believe that we have to temper the rigors of the free market to make sure that we have a socially more optimal outcome. And over the years, as we have developed our economy, we have in fact done so in many different ways. We use the free market, but the government has played an active role in education, providing education almost for free at the schools, universities you do pay. In healthcare, providing subsidized healthcare, good quality healthcare to the whole of the population. And in housing, enabling 85-90% of Singaporeans to live in public housing, and of those 90+% owning their own houses and having substantial equity to their name. Even the lowest 20% of the population have $100+ thousand US worth of net worth in their house, per household. And I think that's one way we have ensured social equity and support for the system by all Singaporeans. I think that it's going to take greater efforts as you go forward, because the way technology is moving, the way globalization is moving, we see greater pressure on wages at the low end, because countries like India are emerging and integrating into the world economy. Even in the middle, for average earners, white collar, we see pressure because outsourcing and BPO is not just a matter of unskilled jobs now, but of skills. We have X-rays, images, medical images being outsourced to be read in India rather than by radiographers in Singapore. So our hospitals take the image, it goes over the internet to somebody in India who's, I think, US board qualified. He reads the scan, and within half an hour you get a good written report what is down there, what is the interpretation. Our own radiographers have raised an eyebrow because it affects them, but the rest of Singapore benefits. But the consequence of many such things is going to happen to lawyers, it's going to happen to accountants, it can happen to engineers, it can happen to management analysts. What more when you're talking about clerks and bookkeepers in what used to be many-layered hierarchical organizations? They are going to be under pressure. So we have to try our best to make sure that our people across the board will be able to raise their incomes over the next 10, 15 years. And that means higher productivity, higher skills, as well as management of our workforce, the Singapore workforce, as well as the inflow of foreign workers who come into Singapore, to make sure that you buffer the pressure and Singaporeans are able to be more productive and to reap the benefits of that productivity. It's not a certain thing, but we have to try our best to make sure that it happens. Creativity is a big part of this, because the computer can do the routine thing, and outsourcing to somebody elsewhere can also do the routine thing. You can outsource invention and creativity, but not so easily done yet. And we have to train our people so that they can learn, they can see new patterns, they can do new things which others cannot yet do and which computers cannot yet do. In the case of India, I think technology is on your side, because one of the reasons for rural poverty in India is because farmers don't have options. The people don't have options. They are confined to their villages. They don't know what's happening in the rest of the world. They depend on middlemen, intermediaries. Their produce is hugely wasted on the way to market. The price they get is far from what they should get if they knew what the final price was where it is sold. And I was just reading one article about Indian villages. This comes from Nepal, but there's a same story. Collecting cordyceps. I don't know if you know what cordyceps are. They are a caterpillar which is infested by a fungus. And and some people believe it's good for you, other people believe it's an aphrodisiac. But you catch them on snow fields, and when you first pick them up, they are worth maybe 50 cents a piece. When it reaches the market, it's $20,000 a kilogram, worth more than gold. And there's a long chain, and along the way, everybody collects value. So the farmer doesn't get the full value of his hard work. And it's the same for fishermen, same for people growing wheat, whatever. But with the internet, with hand phones, with people knowing immediately where the markets are, what the prices are, where the food needs to be sent. If you can have the infrastructure, the refrigeration, the supply chains and logistics, then that's using technology in order to bring the benefits to the farmers and the poor and make sure they gain from modernization, from globalization, from IT. I think it's beginning to happen. You're seeing it happen with fishermen. I read one story of fishermen in Kerala. They used to go to the port. There's a wrong port, well, half your fish rot, somebody buys it cheap. Now at sea, with a handphone, you know which port to go to. The price to you has doubled. The benefit to the consumer is greater. And if you can make this happen all over India, you've got 800 million handphones already in India. Everybody is connected. Soon everybody will be connected. This is one big step forward. And if you educate them, and if you educate the women particularly, so that they look after, bring up their children, first they'll have fewer children, secondly they'll bring up their children with greater investment, then I think you'll see the next generation with vastly different horizons from the previous generation. They'll go to Mumbai, they'll go to Gurgaon in Bihar, all the excitement of the big city lights, and they will transform India. Then you will have new challenges, but then there'll be a new generation of people who can look after them.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Our next question is from Mr. Rajamohan. Rajamohan handles, looks after and comments on global issues. He spent some time in Singapore.
Prime Minister, my question is on the future of ASEAN and Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, as you know, very much is in the news these days. The last 2 decades, Singapore, ASEAN, Southeast Asia have really boomed amidst a thriving global economy. The region was relatively at peace with itself. And then the great powers were largely in harmony with each other. But now, if you look at the situation now, you have the global economic crisis, and even ASEAN centrality in promoting regional integration is being challenged by the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You have the Japan, Korea, China partnership that's emerging on the economic front. On the regional front, the South China Sea issue has deeply divided the region. Even ASEAN doesn't seem to be fully united in how to deal with the disputes with China. And then at the third level, you have the US-China beginnings of a Cold War or a rivalry, whatever you want to call it, which is again stressing the organization. So given these new factors, can ASEAN maintain its centrality? Can ASEAN hang together? Will ASEAN continue to lead Asia's regional integration?
I think we have to hang together, because otherwise, we will hang separately. And I think the ASEAN countries know that. And therefore, despite difficulties, they will work together. India is a member of SAARC. It's complicated to have a regional arrangement with 10 plus partners. We have 10 members in ASEAN. It is, of course, not always easy to make the progress which we think in principle, in theory, should be made. But we believe, or at least Singapore believes, and I think many of the other ASEAN members do too, that we have much more to gain by strengthening ASEAN than we do by going our own separate ways. There will be other initiatives at regional integration. It's bound to happen. Not everything will happen through ASEAN. Northeast Asia, China, Korea, Japan wanting to do a free trade agreement. It's the logic of the geography and the economics. Whether the politics is favorable and it can be done is yet to be seen. The Trans-Pacific Partnership we don't see as a threat to ASEAN, because that we see as a nucleus of an Asia-Pacific free trade ideal. It doesn't include all the Asia-Pacific countries yet. In particular, Japan is not there, China is not there. But it's a nucleus containing both developed and developing countries, north and south, west of the Pacific and east of the Pacific. And America is in, Australia is in, Singapore is a very small country in it, Vietnam is in. So I think it's a nucleus around which free trade in the Asia-Pacific can grow. What we need to do in ASEAN is to continue to integrate and deepen the cooperation amongst ourselves, whether it's physical integration, through road networks and gas and electricity grids, or whether it's logical cooperation through trade agreements, investment agreements, through mutual understanding when it comes to our broader policies, including from time to time policies where many of us have an interest, such as the South China Sea. At the same time, ASEAN needs to strengthen its cooperation with its partners in Asia, its dialogue partners, the plus ones, India, Korea, Australia, Japan, China, and so on. And one major initiative which ASEAN is pursuing to strengthen its partnership with these plus ones is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. There are a lot of alphabet soup. This is the alphabet acronym to end some of the alphabet soup. And the idea is that with ASEAN as the center, with the partners who wish to participate, join together, we create a free trade arrangement. The geometry, the participation, well, depends which of the countries want to come in, but it is a basis really not only for economic cooperation, but for the framework of the regional architecture, working on many areas. Many of the partners are already expressed interest in doing this. We hope that India will be part of this. I have been assiduously repeating this message to the Prime Minister as well as to the other ministers I met over the last few days, and I met the press, I made the same message to them. India has to be actively engaged in the region. You cannot be out of it because the region is of very great interest and value to you. You have friends there, you have business there, you have opportunities and markets there, and it is an area where you want to have stability and predictability and influence. And we welcome you to participate in that influence. And if you can do that through the ASEAN forums, that will help to keep ASEAN relevant and ASEAN as one central point around which many of the regional initiatives can revolve. We won't be the only central point. If the Americans want to talk to China, they will do it directly. If the Americans have a quarrel with China, we don't want to be in the middle either. But we want to be friends with both America and China, and we hope that in our deliberations, both America and China can take part, and we'll find it valuable to take part and be able at the same time to do business together.
Mr. Nainen is amongst our most respected economics commentators, and he writes a very incisive column every Saturday morning. Nainen?
Thank you, Jamshed. Prime Minister, we've met already. The question I would have for you now is that India is changing its investment rules in the way it attracts foreign investment. Do you see that as a problem for Singapore or an opportunity?
Well, normally we don't comment on other people's investment rules because it's the prerogative of the finance minister, and if I make new rules, well, I'm presumed to know what I'm doing. But companies will look at the consequences. Companies will want to make a calculation what it means for them. If you're a company already invested in India, you abide by the rules because what the government says is the law, and you are a law-abiding citizen. You will follow the rules, whether it's up, whether it's down, whether it's favorable or not. There will be legal process if you have views. I think the proposed new rules are going to be subject to consultation over the next few months, so I'm sure the companies will make their views known. The companies which have not yet invested in India, they will have to make their assessment. They will look, they will assess, they will make a calculation. If these are the new rules today, are they rules which I can work with? What does this mean for me after I have invested? Will these rules prevail, or will there be further unexpected changes? Or, most concerning of all, further changes which may have retrospective consequences. And if they are, they will have to make a calculation whether it is still a good project to do, or whether, on balance, maybe it is better to focus their attention elsewhere. So these are calculations which every finance minister must make before it makes its decisions. And I'm sure many companies are doing that.
If I may just clarify my question, it was in relative terms compared to other points from where investment comes in, would Singapore be a beneficiary of these rules?
The investments from Singapore to India are really investments of companies which are doing significant business. That's the way you crafted the rules with us, and that's what has been happening. I think you may be referring to some other sources of investments into India where there are special historical circumstances, like Mauritius. We are not like Mauritius, so I don't expect us to benefit from projects which are not genuinely based in Singapore. I hope that overall it will make the Indian environment more favorable, and therefore there will be more business, and that will be good.
Mr. Prime Minister, you know Mr. Tarun Das. He's been working for the last 30 years in building our relationships.
Yes.
But now he's taken on a new challenge. He's trying to reform the state of Kerala. And that is not going to be an easy challenge. And one of his colleagues from the State Investment Development Board in Kerala, Mr. Vijay Raghavan, would like to ask you a question.
Prime Minister, you've talked about the investment climate and things like that. Kerala is a state which has been focusing on education, healthcare, social overheads. And the kind of sectors that we have been growing very fast are tourism, IT. If you look at it, the strategies which Singapore has been looking at, the kind of areas which you want to invest in, Kerala is ideal. In your, when you've done focus on countries abroad, you've looked at specific regions. In India, it was Tamil Nadu, Karnataka. If you look at Kerala, what do you think the state government should be doing to attract investments from Singapore into Kerala? And also, I would take this opportunity to welcome you to Kerala, which everyone calls God's own country. And you should definitely come there. But what is it that we at the state level should do to attract investments to Kerala?
I do not know enough about Kerala. I have never been there. I've heard much about it and would very much like to visit. I have heard that it is a very beautiful place. I know there are very many talented Keralans. I know many talented Malayalis who are in Singapore. Not all talented people are from Kerala, but many are. And I think you should, so if I may say something off the top of my head, I think you should make the most of your human talent. Because the high levels of literacy, of education, and if you can make the use of that, then develop those industries where human talent is needed and at a premium. The overall business environment is also important. There, the different states are competing with one another, and if you can create industrial park, just now Mr. Godred was talking about investing in an industrial park in Vietnam, which Singapore developed. If you can create an environment like that in Kerala, then people go in there and you not only have the people, the talent available, but also the infrastructure and the business conditions, then that will be very helpful. But you must be quite sure that the Kerala government will continue to support this, and the next government, even if Marxist, will support capitalism.
That's his next job, right? You've told him what he has to do. We have with us Mr. Pinto, who's been a former secretary to the Government of India in the Shipping Ministry. He'd like to ask a question.
Mr. Prime Minister, I must start with a confession. This is the first time I'm asking a question to a Prime Minister. So if I don't do it very well, remember that I'm on the learning curve. Next time I'll be much better. Like most people here, all people here, I would say, I'm a great admirer of Singapore. I visit it very often, and each time I'm amazed at the increasing changes that I see and how much better it is. And one thing that we are told is that at the root of all of this is meritocracy. Everything goes on the basis of meritocracy. You have to be the best. We also have a system of meritocracy, but we temper it with affirmative action, because we believe that there are people who have been excluded from the system for so long. They've not had education in their family, they've not had learning, and therefore it isn't possible to have competition between equals. Is it true, Prime Minister, in your view, that if you have a meritocracy, an entire pure meritocracy, you get a smaller and smaller circle from which decision makers and policy makers are chosen? And how would you admire, if this is so, how would you advise a country like India, which has a very vast and diverse population, with people who are excluded, people who are socially and intellectually, educationally backward, how would you bring about equality and maintain meritocracy?
That is a very difficult question. We operate a system which is as meritocratic as we can make it, meaning that when you go to university, when you go to schools, we try to advance people by merit. What jobs you do depend on how well you can do it. We try and find the best person available to do the most critical job, and we try to reward people by their contributions. And we try to do that in a race-blind basis, because we are a multiracial society, with Chinese, with Malays, with Indians, different communities, and different communities which have different group performances, because their histories have been different. So if you look at the Chinese Singaporeans, or the Malays, or the Indians, and you calculate statistics on that basis, you will find it is not the same. Whether it's education, whether it's social standards, whether it's in professions, and the jobs. There are variations. But our view is, let's look at the individual, and from the point of view of the communities, which are not yet so successful, let's try and do the best you can. But if you become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, I want to be quite sure that the degree is worth the same no matter what the color of the person. And if I'm seeing a doctor, I want to be quite sure that I have the faith in the doctor once I know that he is properly qualified and graduated from the National University of Singapore. And likewise with engineers and lawyers and so on. It is not easy to maintain such a system, but so far I think it has worked for us. And with such an attitude, we have been able to get the groups which started from not the same starting point to make considerable progress compared to where they were. The gap hasn't disappeared, but they have made considerable progress, and I think probably more progress than they would have done if you had just said automatically, well, certain proportion of university places must be given to this group or that group. And therefore, by definition, we have become equal, because now there are proportionate numbers of all the different groups in each of the professions. Over time, however, there is a tendency towards the base to become tighter, for it to become harder for people to go from the bottom of the pyramid to the top of the pyramid. And if you have a meritocratic system, it becomes harder over 1-2 generations, because the most successful people marry other successful spouses, and then their children tend to do well. They are well looked after by the parents. They have more resources. And they do tend to do well. Able parents tend to have bright children. And then the bright children tend to do well in school. So it becomes harder for people who have been, who have poor parents to make it into the top. And we have to work much harder to make sure that our schools provide good education across the board, including to the weakest students and the students in the poorest homes. And if we see kids who come from poor homes who have potential, we do our best to make sure that they are not held back. And we cannot ever have a kid unable to go to a good school or unable to go to a course in university because his parents can't afford it. I mean, we will make sure that his needs are seen to and he makes it up. It doesn't mean you end up with complete equality, but we try our best to make sure that this is an open and a fair system. Of course, our problem is not as complex as your problem. You have caste in a very strong way. You have very big regional differences. And if you just went on the basis of examination results to choose people going to university, you will find a very unrepresentative group of students in the university, and big chunks of the country may be left out. So that will become a difficulty. So you will have to make some compromise and some judgment has to go into it. But at the same time, you have to do that judiciously because you know that there are consequences. Because if you make affirmative action for the backward castes or the disadvantaged castes, then more people will declare themselves as being disadvantaged so as to gain advantage. It happens. It happens not just in India, it happens in America, where they have affirmative action. And it happens in China, where they make distinctions between different provinces. And so people may go to a different province because then the cutoff point to go to university is lower. So you have to make those distinctions, but I think the equality has to come not just from your university system and admissions, but from the broader society to be able over time to dilute these caste differences and to make it a more caste-blind society. In Singapore, the Indian community who have come to Singapore over the last 2 centuries, we have become much less or largely caste-blind. There are differences. You know, somebody is a Chettiar, somebody else is a South Indian Tamil Brahmin, somebody else is a different caste, and some distinctions in the temples. But by and large, we've washed that away, and it has become a much more equal group. I think in India, it has not happened to the same degree, definitely in the rural areas. In the cities, it is becoming less noticeable, because when you go into the city, you are no longer tied to the village which you came from. And if you are working in an IT company, they really don't care what your father was. And if that is the way India is moving, well, maybe over time you can wash out some of this. But it's 2,003 or 3,000 years of history of Varna, and you have to carry that. So there is no ideal solution. I mean, you have to make some compromise, but at the same time, I think you have to try and move forward to a more equal and less deterministic formula for who does well in life. You may be born high caste. It doesn't mean you're automatically deserving of the top position.
We have Naushad Forbes here, who's heading the CII Committee on Innovation.
Prime Minister, I know in Singapore you've been working very hard to...
Sorry, where are you? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I said, Prime Minister, I know in Singapore you've been working very hard for many years to build a more creative society, and a society where the creative industries have a much larger role to play. I guess this question comes from many visits to Singapore and seeing how clean and unmessy a city and a state it is. It's very organized, it's everything works, it's extremely smooth. As one creates a more creative place, will there be a need for a greater tolerance for mess, a greater tolerance for things that do not work in quite so perfect and smooth a way? You know, in India we have a great abundance of mess. We'd be willing to share a lot of it with you, but it makes the place very vibrant and very creative at the same time. And I wonder if you see the direction that Singapore takes moving somewhat in a more messy and somewhat more open direction.
I would become messy selectively. There are some areas where you must accept that you cannot do things just in a linear or a hierarchical way. I decide, you refine, he implements. You have to have an interaction, discussion. I float an idea, there will be objections, there will be views. In the end, something has to be done. I just give you an example. We have a peculiar problem which you may consider quaint. We have an abundance of wild boars in our nature reserves, about 100 of them, and they are causing a problem. In the old days, we would have just said, solve the problem, and tomorrow the problem will be literally gone. But now it has been discussed, there have been views, there are animal lovers who feel that you shouldn't cull them, they think you should sterilize them, maybe you should keep them in the zoo and have an exhibit of wild boars. Others who say that they are part of the natural system, and if they exist, that means it is good. But there are also families which say the wild boars killed my dog, And another family says, well, the wild boar knocked over my child, better do something about it. And finally, we have to do something about it. But we have to go through this process of discussion and engagement and explanation. And in the end, it takes longer, but it will be done. It will be done. I'm not sure we'll get the very last wild boar, but we will solve this problem. And as with wild boars, so too with many other problems where we must do something and it involves people and you have to engage the people. When we acquire land, we can gazette, we have the legal powers, but you also have to explain, you also have to make sure that the affected parties understand what it's about and feel that they have been fairly treated. That's some of the political messiness. The physical messiness along the streets, graffiti, I would strongly discourage. I would invite graffiti artists by invitation to perform on designated walls with permission. But if you decide to freelance extra, I better do an investigation and find out how that came about. I think that you want to do this in a controlled way. Once you have let go, Pandora's box is open. You cannot put all the demons back in again. So it has to be done in a managed way. Creative arts, we also want to encourage, and we also want to have flower across a broad range. We don't want people all to follow the same mold, and you must pass the same examinations and be suitable for the same jobs. There are people who are by nature mavericks, by nature nonconformists. By nature, they're very creative, but not easy to work with, and don't fit into regular structural organizations. They are one of a kind. But society benefits from having such one-of-a-kind people, provided you can tap their creative talents and their animal spirits and their energy and contribute to the broader vibrancy which is Singapore. And we are trying to create routes for this so that you go to our schools aren't all academic schools, all getting people to pass O-level examinations. We have an art school, we have a sports school, we have academies for fine arts, we have people doing graphics, people doing fashion, people doing pottery, people doing drama. And increasingly, we also have young people who see this as their passion, who want to go along these routes. And we have creative industries developing as a result. Lucasfilms is in Singapore. I'm sure they have lots of Indians employed. I know they have people from 20-something countries around the world, including from Asia. And they are making... When you see Terminator and movies like that, Transformers, and the car turns into a robot, which then turns into an aeroplane, there's a Singaporean transformer working at making that happen. And I don't think we could have done that 20 years ago, but now there is the interest, there is the climate, and we have created that. But when they come out, they go down to Clarke Quay or to Boat Quay, and they have an evening off. It's a creative place, but I hope it's a clean and orderly place as well. And that's what I mean when I say, give us your life and your excitement in a selective sort of way.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. We'll have the last question from Arunabha Ghosh. He's the CEO of a new organization that Tarun and I are involved with, which is on water, environment, and energy.
Thank you, Mr. Godrej. And, Prime Minister Lee, thank you very much for your very candid comments. It's very refreshing to hear that. Actually, in response to what Mr. Forbes just asked, we had produced a report on India and global governance, which somehow reached Singapore Civil Service College. And the response we got from them was that we need to look at this because India is comfortable with untidiness in the world. And it's perhaps a strength we need to leverage in a more strategic way. But I had a different question for you. A very close friend of mine from Singapore, from my Oxford days, who now works in the civil service, once told me that in Singapore, you need to keep running to stay at the same spot. And perhaps that maxim drives you not just to stay at the same spot, but stay ahead of the curve. In India, we have a challenge of not being able to do long-term strategic thinking. Could you reflect on how, in your administration, you consider the 20-year or the 50-year horizon? How do you think about 2032, sitting now? What keeps you up at night? And what processes do you put in place so that the Prime Minister in 2032 can reflect back and say that our predecessors thought strategically and they've put us in a strong position? Thank you.
If you look back 30 years and ask whether people anticipated that the world would look like this today, I don't think many people would have been able to predict this with confidence. There was a lot of uncertainty 30 years ago. The economy itself in the world globally was high inflation, high unemployment. The explosive takeoff in China had not taken place. The Cold War was still in progress. Reagan had not come in, and Star Wars had not begun, and it looked like the Soviet Union was going to be there a long time. But it turned out that the Soviet Union collapsed, the Chinese developed in a constructive and dramatic way. There have been 30 years of radical prosperity in the Asia Pacific. Today, you've got success stories all over the Asia Pacific region and the emerging markets. If you look forward 30 years, given the European problems, which will take more than 10 years to resolve, given the Japanese demographic problems, which cannot be resolved, given the US fiscal problems, which are hard to resolve, but which, if resolved, can enable the US to do many exciting things, because it's a tremendously exciting, tremendously dynamic and creative country. If you look at China and India, if they can engage in the world 30 years from now with per capita GDPs 5-10 times what it is today, peacefully, then I think it will be a radically different world. If the transformation doesn't take place peacefully, if there's a fracture either because of economic reasons or because of strategic reasons, not, I hope, leading to military misunderstanding, but ending up in bad relations between America and China or China and India, then of course it's a very different world. Which will it be? We hope it will be the first, but we must always have something in our pocket just in case it is the second. For Singapore to get prepared for the first scenario, we must be somewhere near the leading edge. Today, we are not necessarily the most advanced city in the world. In fact, if you look at all the cities which are ranked highest, I think Brookings did a study recently. We are not in the top 20. You will have places like San Francisco, San Jose, Helsinki, Geneva, London. And Singapore is not in the top 20. They didn't count the rest, so we don't know where we stand. In terms of per capita comparison with other countries, we rank very high. Our per capita GDP, according to the World Bank or the IMF, is higher than everybody else, higher than America, higher than Swiss, higher than US. We are only behind Luxembourg and Qatar. I don't believe we really truly are wealthier than everybody else or more advanced than everybody else other than Luxembourg and Qatar. This is PPP. But it shows that country to country we have been not unsuccessful. And therefore, we have a certain standing in the world. I mean, we are doing things which are valuable to us and interesting to others. And so people come and look at us and wonder whether we can be a bit more untidy, whether we can take a bit more risk, whether we can be bolder and advance further. And in fact, we do want to try and some of these unconventional approaches, because if you keep on being conventional, you're not going to remain at that leading edge. But for the next 20 years, you have to continue to be moving ahead with the other cities, with the other countries. Because if 20 years from now you are no longer ranking near where people are interested to study, then cities of 3 million people in a world where there are By then, maybe 8, 9 billion population. Dime a dozen. India will have maybe 30, 40, 50 such cities. What will make us be the special place where you want to put your global headquarters? That requires skills, requires education, requires great talent concentration, requires an ability to work together amongst our population so that even if individually you are just a bit better than others, collectively we are significantly ahead. And able to continue to reinvent ourselves and stay in a good relative position. I think that is what Singapore needs to work towards. It's not easy to do because you cannot do it by fiat. And you cannot do it just bottom up. You can't say, let's be good, and everybody says, ah, yes, and then we move forward and we achieve this. There has to be guidance, there has to be programs, whether it's education, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's our social infrastructure, developing the safety nets, whether it's creating the ethos so that people feel that spirit that I can be near the leading edge. And I want to be one of the little red dots in the world. And to keep that spirit for more than one generation. And that's quite different. In India, you became independent in 1947. It's now 2 generations, maybe 2.5 generations. The spirit when you first became independent, when you had the tryst with destiny, and the spirit today, and you think of the years you have gone in between, how many changes there have been in the mood, and the angst, and the tensions, and the, I wouldn't say disappointments, but you go through a period when the high excitement of independence becomes the ordinary grind of making your life work. And then you have another burst of takeoff and excitement, and then you get to a new level. And of course you have to keep on going to the next level. And we didn't start in 1947, we started in 1965. 30 years from now, we will be roughly where India is today. And if we can do something like what you have done, in terms of relative positioning, I think whoever is Prime Minister in 2030, he may not have an easy job, but he can be satisfied that we have given him a fair shake of the dice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that insightful sharing, and thank you, Mr. Godrich, for moderating the session. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands once again to thank the Prime Minister of Singapore for the dialogue. It's my pleasure now to invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of ISAS, to deliver the vote of thanks. Ambassador Pillai, please.
Prime Minister Lee, Mrs. Lee, Mr. Heng Swee Keat, Speaker of Parliament, Mr. Michael Palmer, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We have come to the end of the Singapore Symposium for this year, after a day of substantive discussions. The high point of today's symposium was what you have just witnessed, the very scintillating discussion with our Prime Minister. We earlier had a special address by Mr. Heng Swee Keat on a very important subject, that is education linked to economic development. This is the second Singapore Symposium being organized by ISAS in New Delhi. The first Singapore Symposium was organized in Delhi in 2009, where the highlight of the day was the dialogue with then Minister Mentor, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. I have to make a little pitch for ISAS. ISAS works on contemporary issues pertaining to South Asia. It also focuses on South Asia's linkages with countries of Asia and emphasizes on study of important bilateral relations such as India-China, India-Singapore, India-Southeast Asia. In recent years, it has been devoting considerable resources to studies of South Asian diaspora. It has also begun research programs analyzing the effects of bilateral economic agreement between India and Singapore, and recently the integration of India's Northeast region with Southeast Asia. In fact, tomorrow, I think we'll announce a new study that we are going to undertake. Yesterday, we had announced a study on Sika together with FICCI. The Institute regularly invites scholars and experts to Singapore to participate in workshops, conferences, selective interactions. Similarly, it also organizes large-scale events in Singapore, or on Singapore in India, like the Singapore Symposium today. We had recently launched 2 books in India. One was called More Than Maoism, Politics, Policies and Insurgencies in South Asia, which was launched by Minister for Minister for Rural Development, Mr. Jairam Ramesh. The second book was Resurgent China, Perspectives from South Asia. This was launched by His Excellency, the Vice President of India, Dr. Hamid Ansari. Both events were well attended and followed by very robust discussions. ISAS also works with Aspen on organizing the Singapore-India Strategic Dialogue, the most important track 2 initiative between the 2 countries. I thank Prime Minister Lee and Mr. Heng Swee Keat, Minister for Education, for participating in the Singapore Symposium. I would also like to thank Mr. Jamshed Godrej, Mr. Thapa, the best batsman for Singapore, Mr. Tarun Das, my friend, the Aspen Institute, the Singapore High Commission in India, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and of course the Ministry of External Affairs in India, for all the help that they have given to make this symposium a success. I thank all of you for your participation in this symposium. I hope you have enjoyed the event and benefited from it. I have one more pleasant task to do. Here, Prime Minister, I have to change hats, become a little selectively messy, and talk about a joint venture, a Singapore-India joint venture, which is a company called Gateway Distriparks. I disclose my interests. I am part of the Singapore Consortium of Investors, and I'm chairman of the company. We have produced a book to commemorate your visit. Now, why do we do this? Our first MOU for establishing this joint venture was signed in 1994 when then Prime Minister, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, visited India. And it was done in the presence of Mr. Yeo Chow Tong, who was the Minister for Trade and Industry. This MOU progressed to a joint venture agreement, and that was signed when Mr. Narasimha Rao came to Singapore later the same year. So we felt it was appropriate that we come out with a commemorative book recounting the 18 years of the progress that we have made. We have kept in tandem with Singapore's involvement and expanding ties with India, and therefore we felt it appropriate to produce this book to commemorate your visit. The overarching message of this book is that India poses many challenges to the foreign investor, but you handle the issues deftly, you keep a steady hand, and you focus, there are good rewards to be had. We have progressed from one segment of the logistics industry to 3. We have had partners from outside India. Blackstone is a partner, Mitsubishi is a partner, IFC is a partner. And we have done well. We have looked after our shareholders. We have 48,000 shareholders. We are a small company by Indian standards, but we have a story which is a very pleasant one to tell. Now, I would like to invite my Indian partner, who is the deputy chairman of the company, to present you with this book. Prem, please. Prem Kishan Gupta. Prem. Yeah, no, it's okay. What do I say? Do I have to end? No need, no? Thank you, Prime Minister. And I think all of you can have a copy if you so desire. It's outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pillai. Next, ISA's co-host of today's Singapore Symposium, Aspen Institute India, will present a token of appreciation to the Prime Minister. It's a pleasure now to invite Mr. Thapar, Chairman Aspen Institute India, to present the token to the Prime Minister. Thank you, Prime Minister. We would appreciate if you let the Prime Minister and his guest to take leave first. Our distinguished guests, tea and coffee is served at the hall just next to you behind, at the Mumtaz Hall. Please help yourself, and thank you so much for your support and presence for today's event. Thank you, and have a good evening.